Hello, everyone. I'm Siobhan McDonald from Granger Street Studios. Thanks for being here with me today. Makes me so happy to know you're watching. I know I say it every time, but it really does. It gives me something to look forward to, and knowing that you're on the other side of this screen just warms my heart. Today, I have a very special program for you. It's about a holiday that we will be celebrating in June, and there are a few holidays in June. Flag Day is in June, Father's Day is in June, but this is a pretty new holiday. So let's get started with our program. It's been celebrated annually on June 19th in various parts of the United States since 1865. The day was recognized as a federal holiday on June 17th, 2021, when President Joe Biden signed the Juneteenth National Independence Day Act into law. Let me begin, though, by thanking the folks from AgeSpan, formerly known as Elder Services of Merrimack Valley, for hosting this event. I'd also like to thank Right at Home Boston North, the award-winning home health agency, for sponsoring this program and helping us all to stay safe, healthy, and connected. I'm wondering if anyone here has ever celebrated Juneteenth. I just went to my first Juneteenth celebration in Marblehead, Massachusetts last year. There was a flag raising at a historic building here in town, and people gave speeches. Then a young woman read a beautiful poem. There may be celebrations in your area, so be sure to ask at your town or city hall or senior center. So what is Juneteenth? Well, Juneteenth is the oldest nationally celebrated commemoration of the ending of slavery in the United States. From its Galveston, Texas origin in 1865, the observance of June 19th as the African American Emancipation Day has spread across the US and beyond. On Freedom's Eve, or the eve of January 1st, 1863, the first watch night services took place. On that night, enslaved and free African Americans gathered in churches and private homes all across the country, awaiting news that the Emancipation Proclamation had taken effect. At the stroke of midnight, prayers were answered as all enslaved people in Confederate states were declared legally free. Union soldiers, many of whom were Black, marched onto plantations and across cities in the South, reading small copies of the Emancipation Proclamation, spreading the news of freedom in the Confederate States. Only through the 13th Amendment did emancipation end slavery throughout the United States. But not everyone in Confederate territory would immediately be free. Even though the Emancipation Proclamation was made effective in 1863, it could not be implemented in places still under Confederate control. As a result, in the westernmost Confederate state of Texas, enslaved people would not be free until much later. Freedom finally came on June 19th, 1865. A full 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. When some 2,000 Union troops arrived in Galveston Bay, Texas, the Army announced that the more than 250,000 enslaved Black people in the state were free by executive decree. And this day came to be known as Juneteenth by the newly freed people in Texas. Let's watch this video together to learn more about Juneteenth.
You might notice it on your calendar this month, a holiday on the 19th of June called Juneteenth. But what is Juneteenth? Fordham University professor Laurie Brooks has the story.
Juneteenth is an African-American holiday that celebrates the emancipation of African-American slaves in Texas in 1865. And because Texas was not at the center of the theater of battle in the Civil War, they received the news of Robert E. Lee's surrender much later. When the Major General of the Union Army, Gordon Granger, arrived in Texas, it was June 18th, and the next day he announced the emancipation of African-American slaves, and the formerly enslaved African-Americans then turned that into a holiday. And of course, Juneteenth is a combination of the month of June and the date, the 19th. It's actually one of many emancipation celebrations that African Americans have had over the years. So one reason Juneteenth became a national celebration today is because of the Poor People's March in 1968. The Poor People's March was a sort of second arm of the civil rights movement. After Martin Luther King's assassination, Reverend Ralph Abernathy led the Poor People's Campaign and protest in Washington, D.C. And because it wasn't going too well, there was a lot of infighting and leadership conflict and conflict with the federal government. They needed to end the campaign on a high note. And so they decided to celebrate the 19th of June, Juneteenth, as a sort of commemorative celebration, and also as a way to sort of cap off the poor people's occupation of the mall in Washington. And then Juneteenth was sort of filtered through the rest of the country as those members who were involved in the Poor People's Campaign returned to their homes, and local cities began their own Juneteenth celebrations. Juneteenth today becomes an opportunity to remind Americans of the distinctive contributions that African Americans have made in culture, but also to remind African Americans of their own past that has been about striving for access, for opportunity, and to be represented in a dignified and humane way. Hopefully Juneteenth will be one of those holidays that Americans who are not African Americans can find a way to take part in a way that celebrates this history, this embrace of a common humanity that is so central to African American history.
I'm so thankful that we have the resources to learn more of this history. Here's a photo of an early June 19th celebration in Richmond, Virginia. And a few more from Corpus Christi, Texas in 1913. Notice how these wagons are so beautifully decorated with hundreds of flowers. And here's another video about the history of Juneteenth. Some of the information you've already heard, but I don't think it will hurt us to hear it again. And this short video has some beautiful music.
Sometime in the water, sometime in the water, sweet Jesus, He carried me. Sometime in the water, sometime in the water.
The Emancipation Proclamation was signed by President Abraham Lincoln on January 1st, 1863, officially declaring the freedom of over 3.5 million black slaves. However, news didn't make it as far as people would have originally thought. The American Civil War began on April 12, 1861, and 4 long years later, the Confederacy was defeated at the total cost of 620,000 Union and Confederate soldiers as of June 2, 1865. By the time the war ended in 1865, about 180,000 black men had served as soldiers in the U.S. Army. This was about 10% of the total Union fighting force. About 90,000 were former or contraband slaves from the Confederate States. About half of the rest were from the loyal border states, and the rest were free blacks from the North. 40,000 black soldiers died in the war, 10,000 in battle, and 30,000 from illness or infection. During the war, slavery in Texas was relatively unaffected because the state experienced no large-scale fighting or significant presence of Union troops. Many slave owners from outside the Lone Star State viewed it as a safe haven and moved there with their slaves. After the war came to a close in the spring of 1865, with General Granger's arrival in Galveston to announce that the Civil War had ended, signaled freedom for Texas's 250,000 slaves, they had no idea that their freedom had been secured by the government. On June 19, 1865, General Granger made the following announcement, which read as follows. The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. Celebrations broke out among newly freed blacks, although emancipation didn't happen overnight for everyone. On plantations, masters had to decide when and how to announce the news or wait for a government agent to arrive. In some cases, slave owners withheld the information until after harvest season. Even in Galveston, the ex-Confederate mayor flouted the army by forcing the freed people back to work. Those who acted on the news did so at their peril. Many men and women were lynched or shot in their attempts to pursue their newfound freedom. In one extreme case, according to Hayes Turner, a former slave named Katie Darling continued working for her mistress another 6 years. According to Darling, her mistress whipped her after the war just like she did before. Hardly the recipe for a celebration, which is what makes the story of Juneteenth all the more remarkable. Defying confusion and delay, terror and violence, the newly freed black men and women of Texas, with the aid of the Freedmen's Bureau, itself delayed from arriving until September 1865, now had a date to rally around. In one of the most inspiring grassroots efforts of the post-Civil War period, they transformed June 19th from a day of unheeded military orders into their own annual rite, Juneteenth, beginning 1 year later in 1866.
Wow, you can probably understand why I wanted to show that second video. This history is tough, isn't it? It's tough to hear that people were declared free, and yet so many people really weren't free. So I'd like to just pause for a moment to let it sink in the fact that I learned about the Emancipation Proclamation probably when I was in middle school, decades ago. And yet I'm really just learning about the history of Juneteenth these past couple of years. So if this is new to you, I'd like to say thanks again for listening. This is how we can support and be allies. We can learn about history and appreciate the fact that our learning doesn't have to end. And gosh, I sure do love a good celebration, don't you? This photo shows Martha Yates Jones on the left and Pinky Yates on the right, daughters of Reverend Jack Yates, who you'll hear more about in a moment. They're in a decorated carriage parked in front of the Antioch Baptist Church, which is located in Houston's 4th Ward. This photo was taken in 1908. Gorgeous. Now, of course, violence towards Black Americans didn't magically evaporate with emancipation, and racial segregation and prejudice in some places made Juneteenth celebrations very difficult. Often forbidden from celebrating on public land, many gatherings had to be held in remote rural areas or small church grounds, leading some Black Texan communities to band together and buy land specifically for celebrating Juneteenth and other community occasions. The first such communally bought land was Houston's Emancipation Park, a 10-acre lot purchased in 1872 by the Colored People's Festival and Emancipation Park Association, which was led by the Baptist minister and formerly enslaved Jack Yates. You can see Reverend Yates pictured on the far left. It's a little tough to see this. It's a very old photograph, but he's on the far left there below that white arrow in this Juneteenth group. And gosh, look at how gorgeous everyone is, all dressed up in their finest clothes. So he is the father of the two young women I showed you in the previous photograph. Let's take a peek at that again. There they are, and there's their dad. Now, here are some pictures of Emancipation Park today. As the owners lacked funds to keep the park open year-round, it was originally solely used for Juneteenth celebrations. The park received its current name in 1872. The city of Houston received the park in 1916 as part of a donation. The city converted it into a municipal park in 1918. From 1922 to 1940, it was Houston's sole park for African Americans, since the city government had declared its parks racially segregated in 1922. Many concerts, musical performances, and Juneteenth celebrations were held in Emancipation Park. Now's a good time to look at some art related to Juneteenth. Have you ever been to Martha's Vineyard? The town of Oak Bluffs is so charming, isn't it? This painting is called Oak Bluffs Celebration, Juneteenth at Oak Bluffs by Sonia Sadler. The first African Americans on Martha's Vineyard were indentured servants, runaway slaves, and whalers. They came for the oil. During the Victorian era, a Methodist revival came about, and they founded the town of Oak Bluffs. In 1912, Charles Shearer, a son of a slave and her white owner, turned one of the cottages in Oak Bluffs into the very first inn for Black vacationers. He saw a business opportunity to provide a safe haven for Black folks who were otherwise unwelcome on the rest of the island. Successful African Americans arriving from all over the country began to turn and transform Oak Bluffs into their second homes. Oak Bluffs holds such immense power for the Black community that the National Museum of African American History included it in their permanent exhibition, Power of Place. And now let's take a look at some quilts. According to legend, a safe house along the Underground Railroad was often indicated by a quilt hanging from a clothesline or windowsill. One woman, who was originally from South Carolina but lived in Detroit, said she learned quilting as a child in South Carolina. Her mother taught her, as her grandmother taught her mother, that you always hold the needle pointing in the direction of the north as you quilt, because that's where the opportunities are. Someone else was interviewed and said that her family hid important papers in the binding of the quilt. Perhaps the code, true or not, is a vehicle for African Americans to explore trauma, the trauma they inherited, and hope. Nowadays, some African American women make coded quilts for their daughters and granddaughters, and that will keep happening. Whether or not the codes are real, because there is controversy about this theory, there are people responsible who feel responsible for this tradition of craftsmanship. Now the artisans using quilt codes is robust. For them, the codes of poetry, healing, and especially a means of expressing history. Artist Renee Allen, you can see her on the right, her Juneteenth quilt was part of a nationally traveling exhibition, and still we rise. What do we notice in here? I would say that that's probably Granger there, holding out and reading the Emancipation Proclamation. We can see people waving and jumping in the air. A lot of Union soldiers, farmland in the background. I can't show the work of female artists who use quilting without mentioning Faith Ringgold. Just as stories evoke the Black tradition of folk tales, both written and oral, quilting has long been associated with domestic labor, women's work, and African-American craft, all of which Ringgold embraces. And here you can see one celebrating a dinner of Harlem artists and dignitaries all gathered together. And there is Faith Ringgold right at the front and center of it all. So these mixed media pieces have paint, collage, and quilting. Let's listen to this poem written by Paul Laurence Dunbar. He was alive from 1872 to 1906. So very young was he when he passed away, only in his mid-30s. He's an African-American poet whose parents were slaves before the abolishment of slavery from America. Dunbar, despite dying at just 34 years old, left piles of work behind. His poems and novels concentrate upon the lives of Black people during slavery and after slavery. In this poem, he's paying tribute to Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was the first woman who had the courage to stand by the side of slaves. Dunbar knew very well that Harriet Beecher Stowe, if she had not written Uncle Tom's Cabin, the plight of slaves might not have come to the forefront. Here's the poem, Harriet Beecher Stowe. She told the story and the whole world wept at wrongs and cruelties it had not known. But for this fearless woman's voice alone, she spoke to consciences that long had slept. Her message, freedom's clear reveille, swept from heedless hovel to complacent throne. Command and prophecy were in the tone, and from its sheath the sword of justice leapt. Around two peoples swelled a fiery wave, but both came forth transfigured from the flame. Blessed be the hand that dared be strong to save, and blessed be she who in our weakness came. Prophet and princess, prophet and priestess, at one stroke she gave a race to freedom and herself to fame. This is one of my favorite works of art celebrating Juneteenth. It's titled Juneteenth Picnic, and it was painted by Black American artist Artello Beck Jr., who lived from 1941 to 2004. It captures a picnic of family and friends gathered together to celebrate beneath a grove of cottonwood trees around 1900. Born in Dallas, Texas, Beck was a largely self-taught artist, employed first by the United States Postal Service before he became a professional artist. His paintings featured not only the African-American community in the Southern US, but also scenes from the 1960s civil rights movement. The recipient of numerous awards and prizes, Beck's work today appears in many major collections, and as a founder of the Southwest Black Artists Guild, he is remembered as a supporter of other Black artists. I think what I love the most about this painting is the clothing, these fine dresses, the men with their hats, the women with parasols, and their most beautiful church clothes. In the distance on the left, right over in this area, I can see a horse pulling a wagon. And that lets me think that this is quite a while ago, probably 1870s or so, that they're having this beautiful picnic. What a day. The kids are carrying picnic baskets. There's food on the table, more picnic baskets to the side here. Do you have some picnic memories? Where did you picnic? Was it on the beach like these ladies on the left? Perhaps a tailgate picnic before a football game like this picture in the middle? Maybe in a park like the picture on the right. And how about picnic foods? What were your favorite picnic foods? I'm seeing some delicious sandwiches here and, oh my gosh, potato sticks and macaroni salad. Now, I just found this picture of this pineapple upside down cake that I had to put in here because that was so popular when I was a kid, but I haven't seen one in a long time, so I might just have to make one of those. I'm smiling as I look at that picture to the left, not just because those ladies are so beautiful, but boy, I love that little grill that they have, don't you? Now, the last time I had a picnic at the beach was last summer, and I brought my little grandkids, and I'll tell you, thank goodness I had a little mini pop-up tent with me because the seagulls were just so, how can I put this, aggressive. Those poor kids, they had to go into this tiny little tent to eat their sandwiches. The seagulls were just trying to attack and get everything. They're very greedy, those seagulls. And they were plenty fat already, believe me. So I have the feeling they had gotten many people's food. So like I said at the beginning, last year, President Biden signed the bill marking Juneteenth as a federal holiday. Throughout history, Juneteenth has been known by many names: Jubilee Day, Freedom Day, Liberation Day, Emancipation Day, and today, a national holiday, said Vice President Harris, who is the first woman, Asian American, and the first Black person to serve as vice president. Painted in 2021 and designed by Reginald Adams, this 5,000 square foot mural marks the spot where General Order Number 3 was issued. This is where Granger came and read that order. It faces a parking lot that was formerly Union Soldier headquarters at the corner of Strand and 22nd Street. Adams' mural depicts Granger sitting at a desk signing documents. It also shows a map of slave routes from Africa to the New World, leading abolitionist Harriet Tubman, Black Union troops marching into battle, Lincoln holding the Emancipation Proclamation, and a pair of empty manacles. A silhouetted Juneteenth parade is shown in profile, and an astronaut in Buffalo Soldier colors gazes over an extraterrestrial horizon. Now, you can further explore Juneteenth by visiting the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. But if you're not going to Washington anytime soon, ask somebody to help you get access to this museum online. Perhaps you don't need help. Perhaps you can just do it yourself. Yay, you. Well, once you get online, they have all sorts of great videos and exhibitions you can scroll through. And on Juneteenth, they'll host some great live events. It's all free online. So what can we do to celebrate and honor this holiday? Here are a few ideas. We could celebrate by eating out and giving money to an independent Black-owned restaurant. Treat yourself to shop at an independent Black-owned shop. I found out that there is a grocery store in Lynn that I'm going to check out that is Black-owned and sells different types of food from West Africa. And I'm really interested in that. So I'm going to go to that shop. That's part of my way to celebrate and to support this shop. You are now among the people who know why we celebrate Juneteenth. And this one's really important. We can unlearn any prejudices we've developed over the years. I felt really badly in the beginning that I didn't know more about Juneteenth, but I'm a big fan of moving forward. And once I learned about this holiday, it made me want to learn more. That's what I'm doing now. I'm trying to learn more and pass it on to you. So let's listen to people who know about the holiday. You can ask your friends who are African American what they know, if they celebrate, did they celebrate when they were younger? There's a lot to learn. We all have a lot to learn. Wow, that was a lot of information and a lot of pictures. I hope you enjoyed this program and learning about Juneteenth. I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to learn with you. And of course, I also want to say a final thank you to our friends at AgeSpan. We're there for you at every stage of life and right at home. Let's start talking about living. I'm Siobhan McDonald. It's been great being together today. We learned a lot of history today. Maybe some of this you already knew, and maybe a lot of it was new to you. Whatever the case, I'm glad we could look at it together. Goodbye, friends. Goodbye, friends. Goodbye, friends. It's time to say goodbye. Goodbye, my friends. You take care now. Until next time. Know that we're thinking about you, we care about you, and please reach out if you need any help or just need someone to talk to. See you next time.